I was halfway through clearing my driveway on a February morning in Madison, Wisconsin, when I noticed her marching toward me like she was storming the beaches of Normandy. The snow had dumped nearly 8 inches overnight, and I had been out since 6 in the morning making sure I could actually get my truck out to the street. My name is Victor Thompson, and I had lived in the Meadowbrook Heights subdivision for exactly 4 months, which apparently was just long enough to get on the wrong side of Susan Carmichael, the self-appointed empress of our homeowners association. She was wearing a puffy purple coat that made her look twice her actual size, and her face was already red before she even opened her mouth. I leaned on my shovel and watched her approach, my breath making clouds in the freezing air. The sun was barely up, and most of my neighbors were still sleeping or having their morning coffee in peace. "Excuse me," she barked, stopping at the edge of my driveway with her hands on her hips. "What exactly do you think you are doing?" I looked down at the shovel in my hands, then at the neat path I had cleared through the snow, then back at her. Shoveling snow, pretty standard winter activity around these parts. Her eyes narrowed. "You are in direct violation of HOA Regulation 17-4-B. Snow removal must be completed by a licensed professional service between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. It is currently 6:45 in the morning, and you are clearly not a professional." I blinked at her, genuinely unsure if she was serious. "You cannot be serious right now. I need to get to work and my driveway was buried. I am just clearing enough snow to get my truck out." "The rules are the rules, Mr. Thompson," she said, pulling out her phone. "And as HOA president, it is my duty to ensure they are followed to the letter. This is your first official warning. If you continue, I will have no choice but to take further action." "Further action," I repeated. "Lady, I am shoveling snow on my own property. What are you going to do, arrest me?" "I will call the police if necessary," she said, her voice rising. "This is a matter of public safety and community standards." I laughed. I actually laughed right in her face, which in retrospect probably was not the smartest move. "Call the cops then. Tell them there is a dangerous criminal out here clearing his driveway at dawn. I am sure they will drop everything to rush over here." Her face went from red to purple, matching her coat. She started jabbing at her phone screen with one finger, and I realized she was actually going to do it. She was actually going to call the police because I was shoveling snow. "Fine," I said, returning to my work. "Make your call. I've got a driveway to finish." I heard her talking loudly behind me, using words like disturbance and refusing to comply and threatening behavior, which was absolutely ridiculous since I had done nothing but stand there with a shovel. I focused on my work, tossing scoops of heavy, wet snow onto the growing pile at the edge of my property. My shoulders were already burning from the effort, and my fingers were getting numb despite my gloves. About 15 minutes later, I heard the crunch of tires on snow and looked up to see a Madison PD patrol car pulling up to the curb. Great. She had actually done it. A tall officer climbed out, adjusting his belt as he surveyed the scene. He looked to be in his early 40s, with the kind of weathered face that suggested he had seen just about everything in his career. "Morning," he said, approaching with a neutral expression. "I am Officer Martinez. Got a call about a disturbance." Susan rushed over to him before I could respond. "Officer, thank goodness you are here. This man has been violating HOA regulations and refused to stop when I informed him of the rules. He was belligerent and threatening." Officer Martinez looked at me, then at my shovel, then at the neatly cleared section of driveway. "Sir, what is your side of this?" "I am Victor Thompson. I live here," I said, gesturing to my house. "I woke up early to shovel my driveway so I could get to work. She came over and told me I was breaking some HOA rule about snow removal times. I told her I needed to clear my driveway and she said she would call the police. So here we are. The officer's expression did not change, but I saw something flicker in his eyes. Madam, you called 911 because your neighbor was shoveling snow. He is in violation of community regulations, Susan insisted. As HOA president, I have a responsibility to enforce these rules. They exist for good reason. What exactly is the violation? Officer Martinez asked, pulling out a small notepad. Susan straightened up, clearly pleased to have an audience. HOA Regulation 17-4-B states that all snow removal must be performed by licensed professionals between the hours of 8 a.m. and 6 p.m. He is not a licensed professional, and it is not yet 8 a.m. Can I see this regulation? The officer asked. It is in the HOA handbook that all residents receive upon moving in, Susan said. He should have a copy. I did have a copy, actually. It was somewhere in one of the boxes still sitting in my garage, unopened since the move. When I bought the house, my realtor had mentioned the HOA but assured me it was pretty low-key, mostly just handling common area maintenance and making sure nobody painted their house neon green. Nobody had said anything about needing a permit to shovel my own driveway. Officer, with all due respect, I need to get to work, I said. I am a paramedic at St. Mary's Hospital, and my shift starts at 8. If I do not clear this driveway, I cannot get my truck out and I cannot get to work. People's lives could literally depend on me being there. Officer Martinez nodded slowly. And madam, you are saying that him shoveling his own driveway constitutes an emergency that requires police response. I am saying he is breaking the rules and refusing to stop, Susan said, her voice getting shrill. If we let people just ignore the regulations, then what is the point of having an HOA at all? Next thing you know, everyone will be doing whatever they want, and the property values will plummet. The property values, Officer Martinez repeated flatly. He looked at me again. Sir, do you own this property? Yes, sir, bought it in October. And you are clearing snow from your own driveway to access your vehicle so you can get to your job as a paramedic. That is correct. The officer closed his notepad and turned to Susan. Madam, there is no law against a homeowner clearing snow from their own property at any time of day. HOA regulations do not supersede a person's right to maintain their property, especially when it involves basic safety and access. But the rules clearly state, Susan started. HOA rules are civil matters, not criminal ones, Officer Martinez interrupted, his tone getting firmer. You called 911, which is for emergencies, to report someone shoveling their driveway. That is not an appropriate use of emergency services. Susan's mouth opened and closed like a fish. I am reporting a violation. That is my right as an HOA president. You can file a civil complaint with your HOA board, but calling 911 is not the correct channel for this, the officer said. In fact, filing a false police report is a violation of Wisconsin Statute 946.49. This situation does not constitute any kind of criminal activity or legitimate emergency. I watched as the color drained from Susan's face, then came rushing back even redder than before. False report. I am not making a false report. He is breaking the rules. Madam, I am going to give you a citation for misuse of emergency services, Officer Martinez said, pulling out a different pad from his belt. What you have described is not a police matter. You have wasted city resources and my time on what amounts to a neighborhood dispute. This is outrageous, Susan sputtered. I am the HOA president. I have authority in this community. Your HOA authority does not extend to dictating when people can shovel their driveways or to filing false police reports, the officer said calmly, writing on the pad. What is your full name? I am not giving you my name. I am the victim here. Madam, I need your identification for the citation. You can provide it voluntarily, or I can request it officially, but either way I need it. Susan looked like she wanted to argue more, but something in the officer's expression must have convinced her that was a bad idea. She fumbled in her coat pocket and pulled out her wallet, yanking out her driver's license and practically throwing it at him. Officer Martinez took it without comment, copied down the information, and handed it back along with the citation. This is a citation for filing a false report and misuse of emergency services. You have the right to contest it in court if you choose. The information is all on the form. Susan stared at the paper in her hand like it was a snake. This is discrimination. I am being punished for trying to maintain community standards. You are being cited for misusing 911, the officer corrected. My advice would be to familiarize yourself with what constitutes an actual emergency before calling again. He turned to me. Sir, you are free to continue shoveling your driveway whenever you need to. Have a good day. Thank you, officer, I said, genuinely relieved. As Officer Martinez walked back to his patrol car, Susan stood there clutching her citation, her whole body trembling with rage. I expected her to storm off, but instead she rounded on me. This is your fault, she hissed. You and your attitude. You think you can just move into this neighborhood and ignore the rules that the rest of us have worked so hard to establish. I think I can shovel my driveway so I can get to work and help save people's lives, I said, keeping my voice level. If that is against your rules, then your rules are stupid. You have no respect for this community, she said. No respect for order or standards. People like you ruin neighborhoods. People like me, I repeated. You mean people who work 12-hour shifts at the hospital and just want to keep their driveway clear? Yeah, we are real troublemakers. She opened her mouth to respond, but I had already turned back to my shoveling. I heard her make a noise of pure frustration, then the sound of her stomping back toward her house, which was 3 doors down from mine. The patrol car pulled away, and the street fell quiet again except for the scrape of my shovel against the concrete. I finished clearing the driveway, threw the shovel in the garage, and headed inside to grab a quick shower before work. My wife Denise had been watching from the window, and she met me at the door with wide eyes. Did Susan actually call the cops on you for shoveling? She asked. She did, I said, kicking off my boots. And the officer gave her a citation for filing a false report. Denise laughed, a short, sharp sound of disbelief. I cannot believe her. I can believe her because she has been making comments about our lawn since we moved in, but calling the police. That is insane. She is the HOA president apparently, I said. I guess that means she thinks she runs the whole neighborhood. Well, she just found out she does not, Denise said. Do you think this is going to blow back on us? That was the question, was not it? I had lived in places with homeowners associations before, and I knew they could make life miserable if they wanted to. Fines for every little violation, constant inspection notices, liens on your property if you did not pay up. But I also knew that most HOA rules had to be reasonable and consistently enforced, and something told me Susan's interpretation of the snow removal regulation was neither. I will look through that HOA packet when I get home, I said. See what we are actually dealing with. But right now, I need to get to work. The shift at the hospital was busy, which was typical for post-snowstorm days. Car accidents, slip and falls, heart attacks from people overdoing it while shoveling. I told a few of my co-workers about the morning's incident during our lunch break, and they all thought it was hilarious. My partner Jenna, who had been a paramedic for 15 years, just shook her head. HOAs are the worst, she said. My parents dealt with one that tried to fine them for having the wrong shade of white on their mailbox. The wrong shade of white. It took them 6 months and a lawyer to get it sorted out. That is what I am worried about, I admitted. This woman seems like the type to hold a grudge. Document everything, Jenna advised. Every interaction, every letter, every complaint. If she starts harassing you, you will want a paper trail. That turned out to be excellent advice. When I got home that evening, exhausted from the shift, there was an envelope taped to my front door. Inside was an official-looking letter on Meadowbrook Heights HOA letterhead. I read it standing in my entryway, still wearing my coat. Dear Mr. Thompson, it began. This letter serves as formal notification that you are in violation of HOA Regulation 17.4b regarding snow removal. As per community guidelines, all snow removal must be performed by licensed professionals during designated hours. Your violation this morning has been documented and will be noted in your permanent resident file. A fine of $250 has been assessed to your account and must be paid within 30 days. Failure to pay will result in additional penalties and potential legal action. Regards, Susan Carmichael, HOA President. I read it twice to make sure I was not hallucinating. She was actually fining me for shoveling my own driveway, after being cited by the police for calling them about it. You have got to be kidding me, I muttered. Denise came down the stairs and saw my face. What is wrong? I handed her the letter. She read it, and her expression went from curious to angry in about 3 seconds. She cannot do this. Can she do this? I have no idea, I said, but I am going to find out. I went out to the garage and dug through the moving boxes until I found the HOA packet. It was a thick binder with about 100 pages of rules and regulations, all printed in tiny font. I sat down at the kitchen table and started reading while Denise made dinner. Regulation 17.4b did exist. It was buried in a section about winter maintenance, and it did say that snow removal should be performed by licensed professionals during daylight hours. But as I read more carefully, I noticed something. The regulation was listed under Common Area Maintenance Guidelines. Common areas. Not private property. I flipped to the definitions section at the front of the binder. Common areas are defined as all streets, sidewalks, green spaces, playgrounds, and community facilities owned and maintained collectively by the HOA. So the snow removal rule applied to the common areas, not to individual driveways. Susan had either misread the regulation or was deliberately misapplying it. I kept reading and found another interesting section. Any fines assessed by the HOA had to be approved by a majority vote of the board at an official meeting. The HOA president could not just unilaterally decide to fine someone. She does not have a leg to stand on, I told Denise, showing her the relevant sections. This rule does not even apply to private driveways, and even if it did, she cannot fine me without a board vote. So what do? Denise asked. I write her back and tell her the fine is invalid, I said, and if she keeps pushing, I will get a lawyer involved. I spent an hour that evening drafting a response letter. I kept it professional but firm, citing the specific regulations and explaining why her interpretation was incorrect. I also mentioned the citation she had received that morning for filing a false police report, and suggested that maybe she should focus on actually reading the HOA rules before trying to enforce them. I printed 2 copies, put one in an envelope, and hand-delivered it to Susan's house. She did not answer the door, but I knew she was home because I could see lights on and hear a television playing. I left the envelope in her mailbox and kept the other copy for my records. 2 days passed without incident. Then on Saturday morning, I was in my garage working on organizing my tools when I heard a commotion outside. I walked out to find Susan standing in my front yard with a tape measure, measuring the distance from my property line to where I had piled the snow from my driveway. "What are you doing?" I asked. She jumped, clearly not expecting me to be home. "I am documenting violations." "What violations?" She gestured to the snow pile. "This snow is encroaching on the common area by approximately 6 inches. That is a violation of Regulation 12-2-A, which prohibits residents from placing personal items or debris on common property." I looked at the snow pile, then at the actual common area, which was a strip of grass between the sidewalk and the street, currently buried under 8 inches of undisturbed snow. My pile was nowhere near it. "That is my property line," I said, pointing to the edge of my driveway. "The snow is on my property." "I have measured it," Susan said triumphantly, holding up the tape measure. 6 inches over the line." "Show me," I said. She made a big production of measuring from what she claimed was the property line to the edge of the snow pile. I watched her carefully, and sure enough, she was measuring from about 6 inches inside my actual property line. "That is not where the property line is," I said. "Do you have the survey map?" "I have been HOA president for 8 years, Susan said coldly. "I know where the property lines are." "Great, then you will have no problem showing me the official survey," I said. "Because I have one from when I bought the house, and it shows something different." Her face tightened. "I do not need to prove anything to you. I am documenting the violation, and you will receive notice of the fine." "You cannot fine me," I said, keeping my voice calm even though I was getting frustrated. "You need a board vote to assess fines. It is in the HOA bylaws. Did you not read the letter I left you?" "Your letter was full of lies and distortions," she snapped. "You clearly have no understanding of how HOAs work or what my authority encompasses." "I understand that you have been abusing that authority," I said. "And I am not going to pay a single cent in bogus fines. If you want to take this further, we can involve lawyers and have them sort it out. But I am warning you right now, you are not going to win." Susan's eyes narrowed to slits. "We will see about that. You have made an enemy of the wrong person, Mr. Thompson. I have gotten rid of problem residents before, and I will get rid of you too." She turned and marched off before I could respond to that unsettling threat. I stood there in my yard, feeling a mix of anger and disbelief. This was getting out of hand fast. I went back inside and called my real estate agent, a woman named Patricia who had helped us find the house. She was sympathetic, but not surprised when I told her what was happening. "I should have warned you more about the HOA," she admitted. "Susan Carmichael has a reputation. She has run off 3 families in the past 4 years with her constant harassment and made up violations." "Why has nobody stopped her?" I asked. "The HOA board is basically her and 2 of her friends," Patricia explained. "They vote as a block, and most of the other residents do not want to get involved because they are afraid of becoming targets. It is a really toxic situation." "That is insane," I said. "How is that legal?" "HOAs operate with a lot of autonomy," Patricia said. "As long as they are not violating state law, they can pretty much make their own rules. Your best bet is either to fight back hard with documentation and lawyers, or to keep your head down and avoid antagonizing her." The problem was, I had already antagonized her by having the audacity to shovel my driveway. Keeping my head down was not going to work. Over the next 2 weeks, I received 5 more violation notices from Susan. One for having a garbage can visible from the street on a non-collection day, even though I had just taken it out that morning before the truck came. One for having my porch light on after 10 p.m., which apparently violated some noise and light pollution rule that I could not find anywhere in the actual bylaws. One for having a vehicle parked on the street overnight, except the vehicle in question was my neighbor's car, not mine. One for having decorative items on my porch that did not meet aesthetic guidelines, referring to the simple wreath Denise had hung on the front door. And one for allowing my lawn to become overgrown, which was particularly absurd considering it was February and there was still snow on the ground. Each notice came with a fine ranging from $100 to $300. I did not pay any of them. Instead, I documented each one, wrote detailed responses explaining why they were invalid, and kept copies of everything. I also started attending HOA board meetings. They were held on the first Tuesday of every month in the community center, a small building near the neighborhood entrance. The first one I attended was early March, and there were maybe 8 other residents there besides Susan and her 2 board cronies, a middle-aged man named Frank Schneider and an older woman named Meredith Walsh. Susan's face went sour when she saw me walk in. I smiled politely and took a seat in the back. The meeting was exactly as boring as I expected, with discussions about playground maintenance and arguing over whether to repaint the community center trim. Then, near the end, Susan brought up problem residents and glanced back at me. We have had an unusual number of violations recently from newer residents who seem to think the rules do not apply to them, she said. The board needs to discuss how to handle ongoing defiance of HOA regulations. Are you talking about me? I asked loudly. Susan looked annoyed at being called out. If the shoe fits, Mr. Thompson, then let us talk about it openly, I said, standing up. You have sent me multiple violation notices for things that either are not violations or are completely made up. I have responded to each one explaining why, but you have not addressed any of my points. You are also trying to assess fines without putting them to a board vote, which violates your own bylaws. A few of the other residents perked up at this. One woman, sitting near the front, actually turned around in her chair to look at me. The HOA president has discretion in enforcement matters, Frank Schneider said, speaking up for the first time. Not according to Article 7, Section 3 of the bylaws, I said. I had brought my copy of the binder with me, and I held it up. Fines over $50 require a majority vote of the board at an official meeting, and enforcement actions have to be based on actual regulations, not made-up ones. This is not the time for this discussion, Susan said sharply. If you have complaints about enforcement, you can submit them in writing. I have submitted them in writing, multiple times. You have ignored everyone. Because they are frivolous and without merit, Susan shot back. Prove it, I said. Let us go through each violation right now, in front of everyone. Show me in the bylaws where it says I cannot have a wreath on my door or where my property line actually is. Susan's face was turning purple again. You are out of order. This meeting is adjourned. You cannot just adjourn the meeting because you do not want to answer questions, I said. But she was already gathering her papers, and Frank and Meredith were following her lead. The 3 of them walked out, leaving the rest of us sitting there confused. The woman who had turned around earlier stood up and came over to me. She was probably in her 50s, with short gray hair and a kind face. Thank you for saying something, she said quietly. I am Linda Patterson. Susan has been harassing my family for 2 years, but I was afraid to speak up. What did she do to you? I asked. Similar things. Made-up violations, constant fines, threatening letters. We paid some of them at first because we did not know any better, but it never stopped. She just kept finding new things to complain about. A couple of other residents came over and introduced themselves. It turned out almost everyone in that room had been on the receiving end of Susan's harassment at some point. They all had stories about unfair fines, threats, and retaliation. Why does not someone run against her for president? I asked. She controls the proxy votes, Linda explained. Most people in the neighborhood do not come to meetings or vote, so they just sign proxy forms letting someone else vote on their behalf. Susan collects those forms every year and uses them to vote for herself and her friends. It is technically legal, but it means she cannot lose an election. That is messed up, I said. It is, Linda agreed. But what can we do? Most people cannot afford to hire lawyers to fight an HOA. I went home that night frustrated and angry. This was not what I had signed up for when we bought the house. I just wanted to live my life, go to work, and enjoy my home. Instead, I was locked in a battle with a petty tyrant who had nothing better to do than measure snow piles and count how many hours my porch light stayed on. Denise could see how stressed I was getting. Maybe we should just move, she suggested gently. Find a place without an HOA. We have only been here 4 months, I said, and I love this house. The neighborhood is great, my commute is perfect, and we got a good deal. I am not letting Susan Carmichael drive me out. Then what are you going to do? That was the question. I spent the weekend thinking about it, and by Monday I had a plan. I started by requesting copies of all HOA financial records, which I was entitled to as a homeowner. Susan tried to refuse at first, sending me an email saying the records were confidential board business. But I replied citing Wisconsin Statute 703.33, which specifically gives HOA members the right to inspect financial records. She eventually sent me a flash drive with PDF files, clearly annoyed. I went through the records carefully, and what I found was alarming. There were dozens of entries for fines collected from residents, but the amounts did not match up with the HOA's stated budget. According to the bylaws, all fine money was supposed to go into a common fund for neighborhood maintenance. But when I added up the maintenance expenses, they were way lower than the amount of fines collected. Where was the rest of the money going? I dug deeper and found regular payments to something called Carmichael Consulting LLC for administrative services. The payments ranged from $500 to $1,500 a month, and they had been going on for at least 3 years based on the records I had. I did a quick business search online and found that Carmichael Consulting LLC was registered to Susan Carmichael. She was paying herself with HOA funds. I checked the bylaws again. There was a provision for compensating the HOA president, but it required disclosure to all residents and could not exceed a specific amount per year based on the size of the association. Susan's payments were well over that limit, and there had never been any disclosure. I had her. I made copies of all the relevant financial documents and sent them to Linda Patterson and the other residents I had met at the meeting. I also sent a detailed letter to the full HOA board, copying all residents, outlining what I had found and requesting an immediate audit of the HOA finances. Susan's response was swift and predictable. I received a certified letter informing me that I was being fined $5,000 for harassment of HOA board members and distribution of confidential information. The letter also said that if I did not cease my campaign of defamation, the HOA would pursue legal action. I took the letter straight to a lawyer. I found an attorney named James Kowalski who specialized in HOA disputes, and I met with him that same afternoon. He read through everything I had brought, including the financial documents, the violation notices, and Susan's threat letter. "This is pretty cut and dry," he said. She has been embezzling from the HOA and now she is trying to intimidate you into silence. That is not going to work." "What do?" I asked. "We file a lawsuit on behalf of the HOA members for misappropriation of funds," James said. "We also file complaints with the Wisconsin Department of Financial Institutions, which oversees HOAs, and potentially with the district attorney if the amounts are large enough to constitute a crime." "Will that be expensive?" I asked. Legal fees had been my biggest concern. "I can do this on contingency for the lawsuit, meaning I only get paid if we win," James said. "The criminal complaint does not cost you anything. And honestly, once the state starts investigating, Susan is going to have much bigger problems than harassing you about snow removal." We moved forward with everything. James filed the lawsuit and the complaints, and he also sent a cease and desist letter to Susan ordering her to stop assessing fines and threatening residents. I sent copies of everything to all the other residents who had been harassed, and slowly people started coming forward with their own stories and documentation. It turned out Susan had been running the same scam for years, collecting bogus fines and funneling the money to herself through her consulting company. Some residents had paid thousands of dollars over the years for violations that were either made up or vastly exaggerated. The state investigation moved faster than I expected. Within 3 weeks, an investigator from the Department of Financial Institutions showed up at the neighborhood and started interviewing residents and reviewing HOA records. Susan tried to stonewall at first, but when the investigator showed up with a subpoena, she did not have much choice. During all this, the harassment from Susan stopped completely. No more violation notices, no more angry letters, no more showing up in my yard with a tape measure. She was too busy trying to cover her tracks. The HOA board held an emergency meeting in late April with a much larger turnout than usual. People had finally had enough, and they wanted answers. Susan tried to maintain control, but when James stood up and outlined the findings from the state investigation, the room erupted. "You stole from us," one man shouted. "You have been stealing from us for years." "That is a lie," Susan said, but her voice was shaky. "Those payments were legitimate compensation for my work as president. Compensation that was never disclosed and that far exceeded what is allowed under the bylaws," James countered. "That is embezzlement, Miss Carmichael, and the state agrees." Frank and Meredith, Susan's allies on the board, suddenly found other places to be. They quietly tried to leave, but several residents blocked the door. "You two knew about this," Linda Patterson accused. "You voted to approve those payments." "We did not know," Frank protested. "Susan handled the finances. We just signed what she put in front of us." It was chaos for about 20 minutes until someone suggested holding an immediate vote to remove Susan as president. It was not technically proper procedure, but nobody cared at that point. The vote was unanimous except for Susan's own vote. She sat there, looking smaller and older than I had ever seen her, as the community she had terrorized for years finally turned against her. When the vote was announced, she stood up slowly, gathered her things, and walked out without a word. I actually felt a little bad for her. Not much, but a little. The state investigation concluded in June. Susan Carmichael was charged with theft by fraud and misconduct in office, both felonies under Wisconsin law. The total amount she had stolen was over $70,000 across 4 years. Her lawyer tried to work out a plea deal, but the district attorney was not having it. This was not a case of poor bookkeeping or a misunderstanding. Susan had deliberately created fake violations, assessed illegal fines, collected the money, and transferred it to herself. She had done it systematically and repeatedly, and she had tried to intimidate anyone who questioned her. The trial was held in September. I testified about my experiences with her, from the snow shoveling incident to the fake violations to her threats when I started asking questions. So did about a dozen other residents, each with their own story of harassment and illegal fines. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding her guilty on all counts. At sentencing in October, Susan made a statement where she tried to justify her actions by saying she had worked hard for the community and deserved compensation. The judge was not impressed. He pointed out that the HOA bylaws already included provisions for reasonable compensation, and if she had wanted more, she should have presented it to the residents for a vote instead of stealing it. She was sentenced to 3 years in prison and ordered to pay full restitution to the HOA, plus additional fines and court costs. The total came to nearly $100,000, which meant she would be paying it off for the rest of her life. As she was led out of the courtroom in handcuffs, I felt a mix of satisfaction and sadness. Satisfaction that justice had been served and that she would not be able to hurt anyone else. Sadness that it had come to this at all, that someone had let power and greed turn them into someone who would steal from their neighbors and use the law as a weapon. The Meadowbrook Heights HOA underwent major reforms after Susan's removal. We elected a new board with actual oversight and transparency requirements. We revised the bylaws to prevent anyone from serving more than 2 consecutive terms as president. We established clear procedures for violations and fines, with appeals processes and requirements that everything be documented and voted on. We also hired an independent property management company to handle the finances, taking that power away from individual board members entirely. I served on the board for 1 year during the transition, and then gladly stepped down when things were stable. I had never wanted to be involved in HOA politics, and I still did not. I just wanted what I had always wanted, to live in my house in peace. The neighborhood changed after everything that happened. People were friendlier, more willing to talk to each other and help out. Without Susan's constant surveillance and threats, folks relaxed. Kids played in yards without parents worrying that a toy left out would result in a fine. People decorated for holidays without fear. Someone even painted their mailbox a light blue color, and nobody complained because it actually looked nice. As for me, I shovel my driveway whenever I need to, and nobody says a word about it. I keep my lawn mowed in summer and my walks cleared in winter, and I am a good neighbor. That is all anyone really wants. Every once in a while, when we get a big snowstorm and I am out there early in the morning with my shovel, I think about that February day when this all started. I think about Susan marching across the snow toward me in her purple coat, so certain of her authority and her righteousness. I think about Officer Martinez and the look on his face when he realized he had been called out for someone clearing their own driveway. I think about the citation he wrote and how that one moment set everything else in motion. Sometimes small acts of standing up for yourself lead to bigger things than you expect. I just wanted to shovel my driveway and get to work. I never set out to take down a corrupt HOA president or reform an entire neighborhood association. But when someone tries to bully you into submission, sometimes the only choice is to push back. And sometimes, if you are lucky, pushing back reveals that the bully was never as powerful as they pretended to be. Susan had ruled through fear and intimidation, but once people realized she did not actually have the authority she claimed, once they understood that her power came from their own unwillingness to challenge her, everything fell apart for her remarkably quickly. There is a lesson in that, I think. About power and fear and the importance of questioning authority when it stops making sense. about reading the fine print and knowing your rights, about standing up not just for yourself, but for everyone else who is too tired or too scared to fight. I am still a paramedic. I still work 12-hour shifts saving lives and dealing with emergencies that actually matter. But I am also now the guy who took down an HOA tyrant, which gives me a certain amount of credibility in the neighborhood. People wave when I drive by. They stop to chat when I am mowing the lawn. They ask my opinion on neighborhood issues and actually listen to the answers. It is a good place to live now. The kind of place where you can shovel your driveway at 6 in the morning without worrying about police showing up. The kind of place where the rules make sense and are applied fairly. The kind of place where the HOA exists to serve the residents, not the other way around. Denise and I talk sometimes about how close we came to just giving up and moving. It would have been easier in the short term, less stressful, less expensive. But we would have been letting Susan win, and more importantly, we would have been abandoning all the other residents who were trapped under her thumb. By staying and fighting, we made things better not just for ourselves but for the whole community. That is worth something. Last winter, we got another big snowstorm, even bigger than the one that started all this. I was out before dawn again, clearing my driveway in the freezing cold, my breath making clouds in the dark. My neighbor Tom came out to do his driveway at the same time, and we worked side by side for a while, not talking much, just doing what needed to be done. When we finished, he gestured at my neat pile of snow and grinned. "Better watch out. Someone might call the cops on you for that." I laughed. "Let them try. I've got a good lawyer now." We went inside to our warm houses and our families and our normal lives. No violation notices, no threats, no drama. Just two guys who had shoveled their driveways on a cold winter morning so they could get to work. That is all I ever wanted. And it is what I have now, thanks to one petty tyrant who pushed too far and finally faced the consequences of her actions. Susan Carmichael tried to use her position to control and exploit people, and in the end, that same position became the instrument of her downfall. The false police report she filed that morning was just the beginning. Officer Martinez's citation was the first official documentation that something was wrong with how she wielded power. From there, it was dominoes falling. My refusal to pay bogus fines led to examining the HOA records, which revealed the embezzlement, which brought in the state investigators, which led to criminal charges and eventually prison, all because she could not stand the sight of someone shoveling their own driveway. I wonder sometimes if she thinks about that, sitting in her cell at the Wisconsin Women's Correctional Facility. Does she understand how her own petty vindictiveness led to her destruction? Does she regret not just letting me clear the snow and go to work? Does she recognize that if she had focused on actually serving the community instead of enriching herself, she might still be living in her house down the street instead of serving a 3-year sentence? Probably not. People like Susan rarely have that kind of self-awareness. In their minds, they are always the victim, always being persecuted for trying to maintain standards or do the right thing. They never see how their actions hurt others or how their abuse of power inevitably catches up with them. But that is not my problem anymore. Susan is gone, the HOA is functioning properly, and my driveway is clear whenever it needs to be. I help elderly neighbors with their snow removal sometimes, especially Mrs. Chen next door who is in her 80s and whose kids live out of state. I do it not because any rule requires it, but because it is the right thing to do and because I can. That is what community should be. People helping each other, looking out for each other, making life a little easier for their neighbors. Not some authoritarian nightmare where every minor decision requires approval and deviation from arbitrary rules results in punishment. We have that now in Meadowbrook Heights. It took a long fight and a lot of stress to get here, but we have it. And I will be damned if I ever let anyone take it away again. So yeah, Susan Carmichael called the cops on me for shoveling my driveway, and the officer ended up citing her for filing a false report. But that was just the first chapter in a much longer story about corruption, accountability, and what happens when regular people decide they have had enough of being pushed around. The citation that morning was not just a piece of paper documenting Susan's misuse of emergency services. It was evidence that her grip on power was not as secure as she thought. It emboldened me to push back harder, to look deeper, to question everything she said. And once I started pulling that thread, the whole corrupt tapestry she had woven unraveled. I keep a copy of that citation in my desk drawer, along with all the fake violation notices Susan sent me and the court documents from her trial. Not because I want to dwell on it or relive the stress of that time, but as a reminder. A reminder that standing up to bullies matters. A reminder that corruption thrives in silence and dies in transparency. A reminder that sometimes the right thing to do is also the hard thing to do, but it is still worth doing. Life is good now. My job is satisfying, my house is comfortable, my marriage is strong, and my neighborhood is genuinely pleasant to live in. I shovel my driveway whenever the snow falls, and nobody complains. I keep my property maintained because I take pride in my home, not because I am afraid of fines. I interact with my neighbors as friends and fellow community members, not as subjects of an HOA dictator. This is how it should have been from the beginning. This is how it is now. And this is how it will stay, as long as people remain vigilant and refuse to let anyone abuse power the way Susan did. Sometimes I see her husband around town. He still lives in their house, trying to pay off the restitution and rebuild his life after his wife's crimes destroyed their finances and reputation. I feel bad for him. He probably did not know what she was doing, or maybe he knew but did not think it was that serious. Either way, he is paying a price for her actions. We nod at each other when we cross paths, but we do not talk. What would we say? The whole situation is awkward and painful, a permanent scar on the neighborhood's history. But scars fade with time, and the community is healing. New families have moved in, people who never knew Susan or her reign of terror. To them, Meadowbrook Heights is just a nice subdivision in Madison with reasonable HOA fees and friendly neighbors. They have no idea what it took to get to this point, and that is okay. They do not need to know. They just need to enjoy living here and hopefully stay involved enough to prevent anyone from ever abusing power like that again. As for Officer Martinez, I saw him a few months after the trial at a community event the police department held. I went up and thanked him for how he handled that morning. "I was just doing my job," he said with a shrug, "but I am glad it worked out. We get calls like that more often than you would think. HOA disputes, neighbor complaints about stupid stuff. Most of the time we just mediate and leave, but something about that lady rubbed me the wrong way. The way she expected me to enforce her made-up rules like I was her personal security guard. Well, your citation started a chain reaction that ended with her in prison for embezzlement," I said. He raised his eyebrows. "I heard about that. Good. People who abuse positions of trust deserve what they get." We talked for a few more minutes, and then he was called away to another conversation, but I was glad I had gotten the chance to thank him. That citation could have just been a slap on the wrist, something Susan paid and forgot about. Instead, it became evidence of a pattern of behavior, one more piece in the larger case against her. Everything matters. Every interaction, every decision, every moment when you choose to stand up or stay silent. I chose to stand up, and it made all the difference. I am not a hero. I am just a guy who wanted to shovel his driveway and go to work. But sometimes being in the right place at the right time and refusing to back down is enough. Sometimes one person fighting back gives everyone else the courage to do the same. Sometimes the system actually works, and the bad guys actually face consequences. This was one of those times. So when people ask me about the whole Susan Carmichael situation, about how a simple snow shoveling incident led to criminal convictions and HOA reform, I tell them the truth. I tell them it started with me refusing to be intimidated by someone who had no actual authority over me. I tell them it continued with me doing my homework, reading the bylaws, documenting everything, and refusing to pay bogus fines. I tell them it escalated when I discovered financial irregularities and reported them to the proper authorities. And I tell them it ended with justice being served and a community reclaiming its autonomy from a tyrant. It is a good story. More importantly, it is a true story. And it is my story, the story of how I went from being a new homeowner just trying to get to work to being the guy who helped take down a corrupt HOA president. I never wanted that role, but I am glad I played it, and I would do it again if I had to, because some things are worth fighting for. Your home, your rights, your community, your dignity. Those things matter. And when someone tries to take them away, you fight back, and sometimes you win.